Hello everyone, welcome back to the Biggening Corporation. Just as a recap for folks joining us for the first time on episode 11, we are doing an incremental game using Business Central functionality, where bots will be the player's tools for creating transactions in an ERP system as a game. And the goal is to have each player run a company, compete to see who can generate the most wealth via their army of bots. So, where we left off yesterday, we finally have our research bots ticking along, and they are capable now of at least completing research. We had our very first research points start to accumulate yesterday, and we had the very beginning of a tech tree in place. So that's a good start. But as we saw when I created a new company, there was a few things I was still having to set up, and that list is only going to grow. So what I thought would be a good thing to do is take a small detour for now to create a little bit of a framework on helping out a system administrator create new players. As I mentioned in previous episodes, I generally speaking don't like to extend system tables like the companies table, and that includes the users table. So we are going to need to track some information about the various players playing along. And that will include things like which company belongs to which player, which user belongs to which player, and then we'll want to see some setup information. We'll probably need email addresses for that. And it would be a good idea from a system administrator point of view to be able to see the initial setup information that got completed for each new player, as well as potentially get an oversight of the current status of the player. I think that would be very useful info that I would like to see. If I'm running a system where people are actively playing in it, then hopefully I would be very interested to know where my players are currently at, maybe in a little more depth than just the leaderboard. And hopefully it's not too crazy in the background. I am being treated to a homemade cake this evening, so there's a mixer running along in the background, and hopefully that's not being picked up too loudly. But after we get our player management in place, depending on where we're at for time, we may go ahead and look at playing with an import tool and how to make one of those. The reason I want to potentially do that is, as we looked at in our master items here, I created some different basic items. This is going to be our core 6 raw materials that is going to drive the rest of the infrastructure. I didn't feel it necessary to go into more detail. Some games, when you're making different parts, you might go more detail, iron plates and iron rods and screws and things like that. And I sort of wanted to have the game be a little less micro for the people who are running this. So, for example, I was thinking about some of the structures of how we would create some different assembly level items, like a canvas tent kit. Well, that would be some fabric and some wood, and I guess nails are not included, so let's fix that. So, for example, we would include fabric parts, wood parts, and metal parts, but we are not going to be any more specific than some metal is involved. But as you can see, it was really helpful for me as I was thinking about creating all the different items to very quickly and easily just throw a number in a column, because I know those are my 6 raw materials that I'm going to care about for my assembly class items. When we get into class 3 items, however, it's going to be a little trickier because I'm going to require some of these kits potentially. And then we're really looking at the fact that if we look at fabric parts here, when we pop open this, there is a subsidiary table. And it's this subsidiary table that we are wanting to populate with this information. Well, we're now deep into a complexity issue that can be pretty common when we're dealing with imports, that we can't directly take these column values and make a brilliant config package out of this, because this is the rows, but then each column here is additional information that we need to treat as rows for this row. That's a little too complicated for a config package. So hopefully we can get to that today. If not, we are definitely doing it tomorrow. I need that import tool because, frankly, I am going to make lots of different items in different categories at the different classes, so that there are many things for players to research, and I don't want to have to come in here and click through creating each and every single one. So we had originally made our little setup overview here that shows some of the information that we need to have populated from the master data every time a new company is set up. And that's pretty good. That is helpful. But this was never going to be the main home for our master data, and we don't necessarily need to know that all of these things are individually copied over. As we saw yesterday when we created test player 5, we ran a code unit that directly ran this little population routine immediately when we created the company. So we know that we've got some structures in place that when we create a new company, company init here, that when we create a new company, the event fires and things will happen. So we don't need to manage this anymore. We don't need that level of info, and that's a good thing. But at a player level, we need per player to have, at the very least, the company information, this routine, and we also will want to have the user information generate, things like the username and a password, and at some point later down the road we may want to have a system by which the player can potentially get email notifications, and in the base product, in the base Business Central, that lives on the user setup, which is related to and primary keyed to be connected to the user ID over here, email, but it is not automatically created by default for any new user. So we need to make sure that user setup gets populated from our users as well. Yeah. So it would be good to potentially replace our setup overview with a player overview. And I think it will be the beginnings of our dashboard of what we'll actually want to see as a system administrator. Later we'll add some insight and overview to all of this, but let's get some basics started here. So here in our master company folder, well, let's close all of our currently open things just to declutter our workspace a little. We are going to create a new table, BCS player. And let's see, we will not have this be the same exact primary key as users. If I recall correctly, the primary key of users is actually an internally generated GUID. But we can keep it simple. We can do just our good old friend an auto incrementing integer. That's fine. There's nowhere that players would potentially be able to use this information against each other or whatever have you, so it's fine if player number 2 is versus 47. That's fine. That'll make some of our generation easier later. Okay. And let's go with player name. And in an interview that I did in a podcast, someone also suggested it would, well, Steve Endo suggested that it would be a great idea to support teams in the future, and this will be a really easy place for us to manage that. So we'll have to give that some thought as well, because I like the idea of a player and team leaderboard. So we'll probably hook into that as we go forward here. But for now, this will be just players for the moment. for now. Let's do player email, and we'll make that 200 so it can be nice and big, and then we'll go ahead and this will link to the user ID, which I believe is a GUID. We'll check that. And we'll need to link to company name, which will be the internal system name of the company, which I believe is capped at 30. Easy enough for us to go confirm that, but and then we'll do company display name, which will probably be a flow field. So, like I said, stylistically, I like to put flow fields up in a big range way up top. There was an interesting discussion on Twitter about, what people liked for their style to object or to field numbering, and some discussion about, like, are there any guidelines or best practices about that. Yeah, so far I haven't seen any definitive discussions on that one, but it is an interesting question. I believe that was on the Twitter for... No, I don't know. Okay, but that's fine. So let's do a table relation to the user table. Yes, user. And let's double check when we go to definition, do we get some nice definition for this? And I did remember correctly. Field 1 is our primary key, user security ID, and here you can see it is a GUID. This throws people off a lot. We often work with the user ID if we've worked with this product for a long time. Pre-Business Central in the NAV days, the code was the user ID, and so there are still places frequently throughout the system where we will call a function called user ID, and it returns this user name field. And so, for example, when we look at that user setup table, they had to support the old style while changing the underlying infrastructure. This user ID column is connected in the lookup to the user name, and they had to do some additional jumping through hoops to make all that work. So a little bit interesting, but we can go ahead and say that that is directly related to the user ID. And we can also do a table relation here to the company. Great. And we will change this to a field class of a flow field, which means we don't need a data classification, but we do need a calc formula. And this will be the lookup where company display name, which I'm starting to get used to typing these finally, where I believe just name equals, field. He says he's starting to get used to it as he types it wrong. Alright, so there we go. So now we will have a nice easy table for our players where we can keep track of their name for our own internal reference, their email address, and some of this information. Later we will hook in some team logic, and we will probably hook in some email settings preferences in a subsidiary table to this. But this should do for now. Let's go ahead and save you, and we are going to create a new page for our players. And I already forgot one key thing. Let's make this a instead of plural, just to keep with the design, player list. Good. And this is another list type page. So the player ID, name, email, company name, and display name sounds fine. And we'll stick user ID way off to the side. Finish. Great. I did not make this data per company false, which is the case. All players in the list. Great. Something I haven't specifically spoken to, but will be relevant in that we're going to tackle this in some future episodes, not terribly far off in the future. We're creating a lot of these tables in the master company that are data per company false, which means that right now, if I were to start creating player user accounts, they could theoretically, right in the URL bar, punch in at the end of the URL, table equals, 88015, and pop open and see all of the player names and email addresses. And that's because we are, as of yet, we have not created any sort of permission restrictions. And boy, are we definitely going to be doing that. Players are going to be heavily restricted on what they are going to be able to do. There are only going to be a handful of tables that they will be allowed to touch directly, and most of the rest are going to be read indirectly only. So for example, code units that are running on their behalf will have access to those tables, but they sure will not. So we are going to have a pretty extensive episode focused entirely on permission restrictions. But because of the fact that there's a PowerShell, or no, not a PowerShell, a command in the palette here that will generate permission sets for the current extension objects. I don't want to do this until we're closer to complete with our data infrastructure. This routine will replace any current permission set objects, if I recall correctly, that we've created so far. So I do want to play with this command when we are close to done. We will make use of that, and it will create a nice permission file that will generate, if we go look in our users, if we pop open edit, and head down to user permission sets, we can generate permission sets from our extension file. So there will be a player and a system administrator permission set that we will generate in here. We could also potentially assign permissions to players via a user group, but usually that's tied to a specific company. So whereas I'd rather for each user go ahead and assign that directly, and we're going to populate these user permission sets directly from the code unit that will generate the players here, which is what we're working on. So now that we've created this player table and we've got our player list, we potentially need to have a code unit that says, okay, now that we are potentially editing the players, we will want to have a management code unit that does all of the commands related to the users, to the players. We could create an area here for actions, and then within the trigger of the page action, write all the code of what we need to do. For example, when we create a new player, we could create a little button in the ribbon that says create and populate the user ID. And it will, go ahead behind the scenes and create a user entry and populate the user ID field. But it is absolutely really good practice, if you can do so, to move your code out to code units rather than on the pages themselves. It is much easier from a system testing perspective. It is good practice and design from a life cycle perspective. Say, for example, 6 months from now, we decide that we want to add that generate new player user function call to some other page. Well, now we have to refactor this whole page to move that code to either somewhere visible that we can call it, or we have to do what we should have done in the first place, which is to move it to a management code unit. So it's generally speaking a much better idea to create code units for code. That's their job, is to be that function library. Pages are about displaying the layout and having the jump off points. So let's create a new code unit for our player management. And I have learned slowly but surely with this wizard, which I am absolutely in love with. If I get that little top-down list, then it probably isn't rendering correctly, just something goofed up there. That's fine. So let's create a new player management, which I believe is just kind of standard sort of practice to name some code units around an area of management. And I'm not making use of it yet. There is now functionality in BC 16 to have the ability to implement interfaces so that you can particularly using extensible enumerators, you can get creative. You can get really creative with implementing interfaces and calling them across objects. I've done that a lot in other languages. I haven't found the business need for it yet within this solution. But if we go ahead and finish this little guy, which obviously, a wizard for a code unit is not gaining a lot of value. That's a tiny bit of text, so it doesn't help us a whole lot. But what we could theoretically have done is all of these dispatcher code units, if we had a common function call on it, say get result text like this, we could have a interface that all of these code units could have implemented, and then in our dispatcher code unit we could write some more generic functions around substitutable interfaces. So instead of having to define that these are the code units that I'm going to call in this loop, I could have potentially had a map against the bot instance that gets the code unit ID for a given enumerator, and we could have wrapped this little code to say, using the interface generic object, we could do the get result text. It's a little bit new in the Business Central ecosystem, so I'm not 100% sure my use of it yet, but I know for working with some of the extensible systems, or if you want to provide extensibility, that can be really important. So for example, if you're wanting to create an engine that sends notices to shipping companies, you might write a core engine that does the general sending and operation and whatnot, and then you would write in a supporting extension that adds a particular supplier, such as DHL, and by setting that up to use interface objects, then other partners can go ahead and write providers for FedEx, UPS, some of the other regional providers and things like that. So I know interfacing is to allow for that extensibility. Yeah. Yeah, so, here and there, folks in the comments on the Twitch stream pointing out there are things that they've not used before, like the wizard. Me neither. So, oftentimes I'm learning it at the same time you are. I only installed this extension pack from Waldo right before I started streaming, so half of these things I don't know what they do yet. Always fun. So we're sort of learning together. Okay, so for our player management, we want to handle a situation where we could subscribe to the event that when the system administrator creates a new player in the player table, we automatically make all the stuff happen. We make a new user ID, we make a new company, and all that stuff. For the moment, I'm going to have that be a manual function call, so that way we can test it a little more directly, and we'll see if it's something we want to have later on. For example, I might want to, as a system administrator, validate some of the usernames, their preferences, their emails, and whatnot. I might not want all the setup to happen the instant I start typing in a new player. So let's do a very basic procedure. Set up new player, and we will take the new BCS player record, And this will be our general function call that will do all of the different little procedures. So we know for a player that we will want a new company, and we will want a new user, and later, to-dos to the rescue, do user permissions. We know that's for sure. So, and then in the wonderful world of functions or make the world go round here, let's do a new procedure called generate player company. And again, we'll take the player record. This one's, actually, we should take these as var, because that way we can update the player record and pass it back to our UI without there being any hiccups. Great. And for this, we will just do a simple company. I don't think that's a protected word. We'll see. Every once in a while I go to name something and go, whoops, that is going to get some funky results. But I think we're okay here. So if player dot company name does not equal blank, then always a good idea to validate that. And if we'll do a check to make sure that 1, the company name is not blank, and 2, that the company doesn't already exist. Now, this is an example here where I am doing a begin, and then technically I only have one call inside of that begin. So it's not required. So a lot of times if you're nesting ifs, you don't need to do a begin. So I'm going to tidy that up because I think one of the code cop rules, if you're using code cop for app source, will actually yell at you about that and say, hey, you're not supposed to do that. So if the player's company name does not equal blank, then we'll check to see if the company doesn't exist. If the company doesn't exist, we will initialize and create it. And company, I believe ID will auto-generate, so fingers crossed, right? Company name equals player company name. If here and there, you will also see as I'm typing along, I still am occasionally in the old Cal world, and I will use uppercases for all the keywords, and that is not the case in AL code. It's just one of those things. JavaScript lazy thing you'll also catch me occasionally doing. I'm checking here to see if this is not blank. This being a string into a boolean in the JavaScript world, this would be true. So, like, oh well. That's fine. If it's not blank, then go ahead and set that. And finally, company.insert. So, and we definitely want to call our true on this insert. That will trigger all sorts of events going on. And because of our code unit that is watching for the company inserts, then we should automatically get all the setup for that player. If someone clicks on the generate player company and it does not exist, I would personally rather throw a little message to say the company already exists. And that'll be a label. Player company. Because I'm oftentimes when I pop up messages to user, I prefer to denote where the beginning and end of something is. So for example, quotes or anything to kind of give us a hint as a user what's actually the message and what's the value here. The player's company already exists. We don't need that bracket. Thank you. Alright, so in that case, if we're just popping an error, again, we don't need a begin end, so error. And I did not follow a standard here. You're supposed to put some sort of suffix on the end of it, which I might pop open the list just to talk about that real quick. I've mentioned it in previous episodes, but it's good to know. And let's do player company name. Here we are. Because we have lots of useful docs, it is the labeled data type. And yep. So oftentimes with data types in the docs, if you take a look, you'll see mention of CodeCop rules. I don't think I've actually turned on CodeCop in this demonstration environment that we're streaming in. We probably should, because it is much easier to do that along the way. But you'll see that they say that a label and text constant type things should use a suffix, and these are the different suffixes that you're supposed to use. I'm not 100% their intended use case difference between token, for example, and text. A little unclear about that, but sure. That's fine. Yeah, so yeah, there's lots of rules, and they enforce the styles of things. So for example, how much space there needs to be around characters and things. Very useful. I will make sure to turn that on before our next episode, and we may end up with a whole host of problems, because I thought I had turned it on, but obviously hadn't, because it didn't complain at me about that. I believe that's just an app JSON setting in our... No, that has to do with the translations. I will refresh my brain on that. It's nothing terribly complicated, it's just you have to know. Okay, so we're generating the player company, and then if we have successfully created that company, we should now update the player record. So the company name, we don't need to update the player record because the company exists. That's fine. The primary key of company is a GUID, if I recall correctly. Key 1, no, it's name. Nice. Alright, fine. And we don't have to do any update of the player record. Beautiful. Okay, so we'll do generate player company, and now we need a new little function to generate the users. Generate player user. This one is one where we will definitely need to get some info back because of the GUID creation of the user here. And as I said, we will at some point later have permission sets that we will work with, but that is not today. So in this case, I would probably for now prefer that you know, what we should do is I would probably prefer to manually give the user a name rather than have any sort of random generation or anything like that. So let's do 40 username. And as we saw when we looked at the user table, I believe that's code 50. Yep. So let's just steal that to be lazy about typing. Okay. This I will go ahead. I will say that is something that we will set. So username. Okay, great. Alright, and so in this case, since we're saying that the person has to enter a user name before we generate the user, we can use a nice and simple .test field, which is a handy little function. And as you see, it takes a field as a parameter, and in this case we want username. This is a real simple, for this record, for this field on that record, make sure it's not blank. You can optionally say must be this, and it will test the value of this field for this. Test field is used extensively to check for required settings in code units like this, so it's a friend. It's a long friend. Alright, sometimes that's a nice way to hear. Up above, we said if the player company does not equal blank, then do this code. Well, the problem is with up here, if we leave it like this and the company is blank, we don't actually do anything. We don't tell the user that we're doing nothing. So it would be beneficial to use the same logic up here to test a field, potentially to not equal blank. I think that would probably make more sense as the user would get some feedback. Otherwise, we're responsible for giving them the feedback. So let's do that. Test field, company name. And then given that, we can drop this entire if statement, because if we get past this without an error, it's true. Okay, so now we'll do our same situation here. If not get the player.username, and now here we have the situation where we're checking to see if the username is not filled in. If the player.user ID is filled in, then they already have a user ID. So in this case, we can say if player.user ID I feel like with the GUIDs there was a smarter way to check that one. Ooh. Now I have to remember my because I know how to check it against the text. Ooh. Refreshing my brain on GUID checking. Let's go to the docs. It's our friend. We can look real quick on GUID data type. Always keep these handy. That's what it was. It is null GUID. So here is null GUID. User player ID. Then we'll go ahead and do things. And yes, you're now expecting there to be stuff, that's fine. And we'll do else. I have too many parentheses, that's what's going on. Looking at the color on that going, what? And if the user ID GUID is not null, then user already exists. Error. And we'll just leave it at that. That sounds fine. If else, error, user already exists. We don't need to provide any more info on that. And there we are. So now we can say user.init, username is going to equal our player.username, and user.fullname equals player.playername. Arguably, I named the field player name. Arguably, that's technically against standards because it is the name property of player, so the player here is redundant. Should probably fix that now. The same applies for email. It is not correct standard to reuse the value here. Whereas in the username, we are referring to the name from the user table, so it makes sense to use the descriptive there. So now we'll just have to do a smidge of tidy up here at our page level. It's always a good idea if you realize you're doing something against standard to try to fix it before you go too far. Yeah, I know you within the code can do F2 to rename the symbol. I don't know if that changes all of them. That might be this change all occurrences. Like for example here, I will go ahead and change that. I'm being told in the comments that yes, that would have been a smarter way to do this. Excellent. I did not know that. I like it. Great. I'm going to try it out because I want to know. So if we rename you to Zebra, do you? You do. Wow. Okay. Roxacorio in Twitch chat, you're my favorite of the day. Brilliant. All right. Well, that's that then. All right. Nice and easy. And it would be a good idea to confirm. We are going to probably end up with a few other things that we're going to need to set in here. I believe the license type will default to full user and state will default to enabled, and that looks fine. That looks okay. We will at some point need to add some logic around generating and sending a password initially to players. We're not going to fight with that just yet. I think that'll take more time than I would like to today, since we are definitely going to fall short on time to worry about an import routine, which I would love to have, so we may start it anyways. Okay, so we've got some very basic functions here where we generate the player company, we generate the player user, and later we'll generate player permissions. And now on our player list page, very simple at the action level, which if you didn't know, I tend not to use it a whole lot, but you can collapse for sections. Super handy when you're dealing with things like actions, for example. So yeah, just something to be aware of, that code collapsing can be your friend. Although I'm adding to the wrong area. Brilliant. Yep. Okay, so before we go any further, before I start mucking with adding actions to places, let's publish and get this new table into the system. Make sure it looks okay. First publish of the day always just takes a second extra. Plus I confused the system earlier with a round of company deletes. So I deleted all but our player 5 company, which if we go check in on real quick, you will see that nice and delightfully so, while it has been chugging along in the background, if we go to our research list, we have completed that research. Yay! So maybe tomorrow we'll have the It's Over 9,000 research. Alright, so now if we go back to, it doesn't matter if we go back to our company, it's not data per company. So player list, brilliant. And we just have this set up as a list for now. We did not do a separate card for that. That's fine. So I am going to borrow Roxacorio for being a helpful person today. Sure. Okay, so you'll see we get a drill down here on company name, and that is because we created a table relation to that. But the problem is that while that seems like a good idea, it does let us jump off to things. Guess what? That means we cannot make a new Frontier company. It'll blow up at us. So that table relation is useful in that it could link to the table, we could drill down to it, but what we want to do is the unusual change here in the company name. We want to validate table relation false. There we are. Oh, okay. That's being deprecated. Interesting. 1.0 or greater. That's a peculiar message. Since we are behind the scenes, we are on version 16.3. That's quite the deprecation warning. Okay. I might investigate what the functionality there on that is. It's probably fine here. Alright, so there we go. We've now created the company name Clever Users. So, right. So now at this point, we don't have the company set up, we don't have the user set up, we haven't created those functions. We also, on the list page, show the user ID rather than name, which I would prefer not to do. I would prefer to show the name. That's fine. And we don't have any validation or logic we need to worry about on the username here, so that's fine. Okay, so now we just need to have our actions. I was doing my actions on the wrong fold, always exciting. So we want to have a new area for the actions, which this will be part of our processing actions. Generate. Let's keep it simple, and we're just going to call that main setup new player. So we'll give that the same of caption, setup new player. And we'll give it a nice image of setup, because I like the little icon for it, sure. And this is promoted true. I don't know, promoted big, I don't think that really matters for the web client. I wonder if that'll be deprecated as well, because I don't know that there's any size difference anymore. Anyways, promoted category process, and finally trigger. Okay, and we want our BCS player management code unit. Great. And nice and simple, BCS player management, setup new player for rec. There's that. One thing that I did not do that I often recommend is here, for example, during the generate sequence, we're generating the company, this happens. We generate the player user, this happens. We then provide no feedback whatsoever to the user that things went well. So that basically it's currently set up as no news is good news. If we don't get any error message, it must have worked. I'm not a fan of that. So let's confirm setup completed message, which I believe message is one of our accepted token types. Setup completed. It's obviously not required, but you know, generally speaking, users like to know something worked. Great. We don't need to worry about publishing and fixing that up now. Alright, so if we do setup new player, we should get an error message because I didn't give a username. Let's find out. It will, however, successfully get through the company generation process, which is going to take it a few seconds or so. again, it's creating about, I think, 4,000 tables in SQL, so it will chug along for a moment. While that chugs along, one of the things that I want to talk a little bit about is how we're going to build our import, because that's what I think tomorrow is going to be all about, is the import routine. We can't use config packages with the data structure that we're going to have, because, for example, I might later on, we put in the ability to create some manufactured items, so maybe I might have a manufactured item that is a standing desk instead of a desk kit. But class 3 office, I might say that the standing kit takes the desk kit plus some power and circuit. So what I would want to see as a user, I might pull from an old system, quote unquote. We get requests like that all the time, where some genius in their brilliant mind decided that the way this was handled is, for example, they have the part number and the quantity as columns going out that way for quite a while. And as a developer, you look at that and you go, wait a minute, we're doing a row, and then we're doing kind of like the rows for this row, and then we're going multi-dimension in these cells off to the right. Are you bananas or wanting to spend a fortune? Why would you structure your data like this? And the answer for me, of course, is this right here is a lot easier for me to write up and design layout. It's going to take some interesting work on our part to bring this in, and we certainly know that we cannot do this in config package. So we are going to use our friendly Excel buffer table. And we're also going to use some stuff that's new to me, which is part of why I'm designing this bananas data structure like here. I'm going to use some new things to me. I have not worked with some of the new list functionality and our ability to split arrays of text type info like that. So I want to have fun with that. So we're going to create a crazy little bomb table within a cell for a row, because I have seen data structured like this handed to me, and I think that'll be fun to have to write an import for. As a crazy preview, since we're still working on it, to parse data like this into variables in old school cal code, we had to do some crazy stuff. Like, this is actually a really functionally useful old school chunk of code that popped a string like this into its discrete parts. And while it's formatted a little crazy, it's still, boy, is that painful. I have written plenty of functions just like this that are utility functions to split text up, and I am super excited that when we dive into this tomorrow, we do not have to fight with that, thanks to a couple of wonderful things, including our new friend that I have not used before, the list data type. That's going to be our jam. You will, if you look around on the internet, you will even find that to not deal with that monstrosity, there are some brilliant blog posts out there in the old school nav world that outline how to take information in NAV and go out to .NET just to get access to the handling available to us for strings to arrays in .NET. It was that it was that bananas. So I am very happy to accept our path forward in the world. Okay, and cool. So we got a perfectly logical error message that we were trying to do our setup from test player 5, and as you recall, it was calling our setup call in the company initialization to copy the info from the present company. And that means that we do need to switch over to our master data company. So that gives a real good example that a system administrator who plays in this game is likely going to run into that problem. We have a separate master data company and a separate set of player companies that we're living in. It's probably beneficial to us in the long term to yes, we throw this error here to say, we're not in a master company, but that's after all of the SQL has attempted to generate the NAV company tables and things like that. So it is probably a really good idea for us to pull this is master company out to somewhere that is a common function instead of this little local procedure, and be able to more easily use that in other places, because then we could do a test for that here in our setup new player before we attempt to run those calls. So that's something that we will have to think about, and since I don't want to get the separate error message, since we had to wait a little while there, we will create a username test1. Okay, and now we do setup new player. This will chug along and create hopefully a company named Clever Users and a new user that is that username. Alright, so I think that puts us in a good position on the new player management. That gives us the basic framework we need to track individual players. It gives us a place to put information for them to live. It gives us a future place that we can hook teams into, and we can allow players to control email notifications for themselves. And that's going to definitely be a part of the system that's going to grow over time. And that is going to become a core component to some of our system manager role center. Now, since we didn't get to our secondary goals today, which I think today might have been one of the first times we didn't make it that far, we are going to bump our master item import tool to tomorrow's primary goal. So tomorrow we are going to spend our time focused on handling the reading from Excel files and pulling in data through code. There are definitely some pros and cons to it. If you are dealing with a huge amount of data, there's some great performance discussions just yesterday on how do you bring in 300,000 records in a smart, performance-intensive way. The general theme of things is it's better to design temporary spaces for data to move into that requires no validation. So for example, you might spin up an import table and then go ahead and create config packages if the data structure supports it, or in our case an import tool that reads this massive amount of data to that receiving import table that has no validation, no business logic. You want it to be as efficient as possible. By doing it that way, you can even go ahead and break one of the fundamental rules of NAV world, Business Central world, and possibly even do imports through SQL to populate that table. By having a questionable landing space for data, you don't have to worry about is it okay. Then you typically would create a processing routine that exposes the potentially good / bad data to the user and allows them to then migrate that through the validation process. Generally, that's much more efficient on the import routines. So we will definitely need to be careful and In our case, we are not going to be dealing with thousands of records, so we're going to create our import routine directly against the live tables and let the import routine do a lot of validation. But if you, like I said, consider your data. If you are dealing with more than a few thousand records, you will find that the import routines from Excel take an enormously large amount of time. And that is because when we dive into it, you'll see that for each and every single cell in an Excel file, per row and column, every single cell gets its own record in a buffer table. So that can be pretty beefy. If you're dealing with 50 columns and 10,000 records, you're dealing with 500,000 temporary records. So it's can be a bit sluggish. We'll thankfully be dealing with a lot simpler things. So we are getting a blow-up error about a security ID is not valid. Okay. Now, the way we wrote this, you'll notice that that clever users company does not exist. So by having an issue during the error, during the user creation here, the company creation was also rolled back. Since company creation is an expensive operation, we don't want to do that. We never want to do that. So let's go ahead and throw some commits so that way those are brought in here. And now we know that the insert true is not generating a GUID. I did not know that. I think that's interesting. I would have expected that it would have handled some of the generation on this for us, but it is, to my knowledge, just a randomly generated GUID, so we can say sure, we'll provide it. Didn't think that was the way we should go, but okay. And that's as simple as a function call, which is create GUID. Yay. That's all. Nothing crazy there. One thing I do notice is that in generating this player user, we do not update the player user ID. So let's fix that oversight while we're at it. We don't have any validation on the modify yet, but we are definitely going to probably add our standard audit fields of like create and modified time. In some of the newer versions of BC, I don't know if it's in yet, but coming soon, there is discussion of automatically getting fields on every table that is the created and modified timestamps. I'm not sure those can be exposed except to API type pages, so I'll do a little more research on that as we go through the series to see, is that in the version we're looking at? Is that a coming soon feature? And should we create our own? And I think we'll probably create our own because I personally like to see those audit stamps of who changed this, when did they change it. All right, we're gonna one more time. Oop. And there is a wonderful example of the oh no second. I made all those changes, I hit the button again, I had not published. So, yeah, well done me. Alright, well, let's see what happens if we publish at the same time it's trying to generate a company. I imagine something will scream. One of the two. Well, the publish didn't scream. Good. Alright. So we'll go ahead and reload you, and now we go to our players and set up new player. Chug. On the bright side for us, the create company routine does get pretty fast, and my temporary database and the main database, I believe, are both on SSDs on this machine, so hopefully it's not going to take very long. Beautiful. And we got our message, the setup completed. So now we should, if we edit and do a lookup, we see that that company now is in our list, Clever Users. Beautiful. And if we go look, we see our test 01. And that got created as we should. Now at this point it doesn't have, this user does not have a password to access the system or any permissions, so it is not a functional user yet. But that, yep, and the system is nice enough to warn us about it. Because there's no password set and they're not tied to Azure or Windows, then there's no way for this user to log in, which is a wonderful warning message. It's good that they put that in there. I would love to see the same message if you haven't assigned them any groups or permissions, that they don't have any potential access to the system because they have no permissions, but for another time. All right. So that's really good. We can also see we have one of our nice easy warning signs of something missed. We should never see a 0 in a numbering field. So this tells me that I planned to make this an auto incrementing ID, and I did not turn auto increment on. So that is a sign of that we should not see zeros there. Auto increment true. Okay, fantastic. Well, I know what we're doing tomorrow, which is nice. Oftentimes, about 20 minutes before I start streaming, I go, I wonder what we're going to do today. So, tomorrow we're going to focus on fighting with the Excel buffer and seeing some of the results of our tool and seeing how that comes in. That is going to be going to our master item table that we had created in the subsidiary information, this master item subpage. And yeah, that'll be good. Eventually, we're going to need to be a little more elaborate. I'll take a look between now and tomorrow. We need a secondary configuration for this master item card. A lot of our all of our class 3 items are manufactured, which means we need not only a bill of material, but we also need a routing. So the routing process, which that's going to take a little talking through. We will need to decide how much time and effort each step takes, how many steps we're going to go through. Because we're dealing with manufacturing bots and operations per day rather than shifts of people, what we will probably do is make each step in a manufacturing routing be one operation. So we'll see how that plays out. But it will require, effectively, we need an additional little table. If we go look real quick at the item list, going a smidge over just to talk this over, but hey, that's fine. Production item number, yep, perfect. So here on this bicycle, we have a routing. And again, routing drives what operations are going to be happening in our facility. And we have to decide how much time things take. So what I will probably do is that each operation in a routing will equal one operation of a bot. And then later, when we have manufacturing bots, we'll have a nice and easy workflow that you can decide which bots go in the step. And we'll have to play with that a little bit, because we'll then be able to start juggling, our players doing parallel or serial operations, and how do we want to let them see that. And down the road we might do some things with how do you visualize that instead of just a pure list. So I will be adding a small subsidiary table to our master items, so that way we can add a routing step. So for example, our class 3 item might be operation 10, 20, 30. So this will be 3 operation steps that we'll want to have happen for example, for our manufacturing bots. So if our manufacturing bot can only do 3 operations per day, they can only make 1 standing desk per day per bot. So that won't be too crazy, but I will make the new supporting table to receive this info tomorrow. But wanted to kind of give folks the heads up. All right, well, let's call that a nice wrap point for the day. We've got our basic player management in place, and we will need to add more to that a little later on once we've got permissions, and we'll add a subsidiary table to that later on for email settings when we get into the email notification engine, but that is a good ways off, so we'll see how quickly we get there, and I'll see you all tomorrow for importing. Thanks for watching, everyone. Have a good one.